Hope you can hear me. This is Matt Davis from Cordis. Thank you everybody for coming. I'm very pleased to welcome Nathaniel Palmer from BPM.com. I'm not going to talk too much because he's the main event. So Nathaniel, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Matt, and thank you for joining us today. So today we are going to talk about Vision 2020, the future of BPM and the business process platform. So just to go through our basic agenda, we're going to talk about how to future-proof your BPM strategy and investment decisions. We're going to wrap up with 5 principles for successful BPM initiatives, and we're going to talk about those 5 principles throughout. We're going to talk about the role of collaborative and social modeling and process mining. It's a new area that's available to us now through these platforms. We're going to look at why the business process platform is available today. What from the platform that you can use immediately. It is something that is providing the pathway to the future, but there are capabilities that you can use today. And we're going to talk about the impact of big data, of social, of mobile, and cloud. We're going to look at the enterprise app store and what consumerization means to you. And these are our principles that we're going to cover today, not necessarily in that order, but just to start with. We're in an incredibly exciting time. We're on the cusp of the second major revolution in IT architecture. The first revolution, or the most recent one. There's a lot that's been going on the last 10 years in IT. You might think that the most recent major revolution was the internet, or Java, or mobility. But ultimately, these are all part of what we're in today. Today, the internet itself and where we are, we're in an inflection point of where we've been, an architecture that's generally been in place for the last 40 years. The last major revolution was the introduction of the relational model. So we're just now exiting that 40-year period. The relational database, and look, I'm not going to kid you, we're going to have relational databases in place for some time to come. But the impact on architecture, that has started to wane considerably, and we're now moving out away from the relational. We're into the post-relational period, and now entering the era of big data. Big data is a big discussion point today. With relational, we saw the way that shaped how we use systems, how systems were designed. The very notion of client-server architecture came out of that. The role of having data managed as a separate entity. With big data, we're moving towards web-based architecture, cloud architecture, towards semantic integration, towards understanding how to refine information through tagging and enrichment, through managing not simply the core data and not focusing just on that structured data, but all the descriptive attributes, the metadata, and getting into the world of complex event processing and predictive analytics. But really, the value is not big data itself. Big data is the buzzword, but it's really not what's exciting. It's what we get from that. And if you think about it from the standpoint of the web, and the web has an inherently document-centric architecture. That was one of the big shifts with how the web came out. There's no underlying relational structure to the web or to the internet. It couldn't exist otherwise. And we've moved from megabytes and gigabytes as being a lot of information to petabytes and exabytes. I'm involved in a project right now where we have very serious conversations about exabytes, something that was unheard of previously. And you can't manage that in the same old structured way. But we don't think of the web as a document or as a set of documents. It's a mesh. And the magic of the web is that it's the hyperlinks, the hypertext, Ultimately, the container type for the web is a bunch of documents, but it's the mesh or the grid that makes it so compelling, and the way that it's really affected architecture. In the same way, with big data, that's really just the container type. It's the shift from that structured model to there are different dimensions to big data and different definitions. Many aspects are in terms of a file structure or flat file structure. There's a dynamic orientation to it, but it's moving away from structure and moving to the ability to have large amounts of correlated information. So what makes big data compelling, or how we get value from that's what the process platform provides. It's making big data actionable. It's providing that thread across huge volumes of big data. It's providing the ability to have those linkages and those relationships defined so that we can have holistic reporting and understanding of events across multiple areas of activities. It's moving away from transactional systems to understanding all of the data points together that shape our customers, our businesses. It's in that way providing transparency to our business operations. And ultimately, it's shifting from a transaction focus to one that's goal-driven. So rather than defining all the paths to get there in advance, it's being able to define the goals that we want to work to every day and providing the metrics for realizing that. So to talk about that, let's just quickly step through the phases of BPM and how we got here, where we are, and where we're going. So with the first phase of BPM, it began as what was described as the third wave. But in the third wave, really we were in the first phase of really being able to have a system in place that spanned across all of our existing systems and provided that process thread. And a lot of that was about managing the UI, managing screen flows, the ability to take out business logic, take out the business rules, take out the processes, manage those separately, and have that work across systems. And that's the way that business operates. Business isn't simply a collection of applications. Business is an understanding of processes, of circumstances, of reports. So it was giving that ability to have that layer across those systems and putting control of that in the hands of business stakeholders. So when we look at the second phase, it was how we move this into really shaping the infrastructure of the organization. Largely, this is where most organizations are today, where we're moving towards the beginning stages of the platform. We don't see BPM as being yet another silo. We see it as being a layer, but that layer is growing both in its width as well as in its depth in terms of how it's affecting and interacting with systems in the organization, and providing the platform on which to actually build applications. And a lot of this has been enabled by the advances in web services standards, the so-called WS Star standards, the standard orientation of frameworks like Java and Enterprise Java, and how that's affected other more proprietary frameworks. But increasingly, we're understanding the notion of building and creating components and stitching them together and being able to orchestrate processes across those components. So where we're going, and I say that we're well on that path now. Some organizations are still just getting underway with phase one. The majority of market really is at phase two, but the opportunity is there to begin and to really engage with phase three and to move in the direction of understanding business event management. We're going to talk about that at a couple of different points today. About moving away from simply managing transactions or understanding and thinking of processes as simply a series of transactions, but really understanding it in terms of motivation, of goals, of the outcomes that define the business, and having your systems respond towards that, being able to adapt to changes in the environment. Moving to this notion of closed-loop adaptability, being able to have the rules, the policies, the visibility in place so that you are adapting to the constant stream of changes. So this is moving in the direction of continuous transformation, realizing that through process visibility, through operational visibility, but the ultimate goal is not about putting in place a system. It's not simply about modernization, but it's about providing that framework, that platform, to enable continuous transformation. So we see now really a new or redefinition of the BPM value proposition. For years we've been talking about the value of BPM, and those values still apply today. As we evolve from one phase to the next, we're building on the previous. We're not saying, oh, we were wrong the first time, now it's something else, the target's moved. In fact, these are incremental values that we see. And so what we're getting today from the business process platform builds on those early values, like the fact that BPM and the platform offers high return for a relatively low cost. Most of my career has been spent looking at how do you get greater value out of your existing investments or the investments you're about to make. How do you optimize those investments? And there's been no greater leverage point for that than BPM as we've understood it, as it's evolved, and it's gotten better and better. And as we look at it today with the platform, it's never been better. The fact that you can deliver capabilities with a relatively low cost up front, but with the platform, moving to this notion of the enterprise app store. So rather than taking an inherently waterfall approach, and this has been one of the frustrations I've had in my career, not just with the organizations that I've been with, but just looking across the industry, and the amount of projects which follow an inherently waterfall model don't realize the initial benefits, but completely obviate the potential benefit offered from BPM in being able to offer, to provide, but to not just provide, to demonstrate, more critically, to show those proof points for early capability, early value, and to build on that incrementally or geometrically. Being able to take a self-provisioning approach where you put a whole host of capabilities out there. Not one big monolithic application, but initially a dozen, then dozens, then potentially hundreds of different capabilities that are available in the App Store type model. The problem in the past, there wasn't an App Store. We didn't see this type of metaphor. So when we looked at BPM, it was often looked at with a lens that was applied to any large transformation project and inherently followed this waterfall approach where all the requirements were attempted to be gathered up front, and then you would go through this long period of trying to prove them out, rather than going through and being able to first show those rapid results, as we were able to with BPM and with just about any version of BPM today, but particularly when we get to the platform, to be able to do that and take a true portfolio management ability. And as somebody whose day job is a system integrator, this is a critical value that I see, both to me, to our customers, and ultimately to proving out the value of the platform. To be able to leverage the platform to deliver these builds for application capability, just as we did previously with previous generations of BPM, where we were able to do that with a process instance. That was one of the great revelations for BPM, and as I had stakeholders, particularly on the IT side, that saw the value of BPM was the ability to create a new process instance and deploy that without having to go through the regression testing and all of that that's required with deploying a new application version or new capability. With the platform, we're now doing that not just with that instance, which assumes that essentially nothing else changes, but being able to package up the rest of the actual application, the UI, the interface points, the reports that go along with it, to have that be managed in a true portfolio way with continuous integration. This is a critical value point for the platform. but to extend that beyond just the deployment process, but actually moving into the realm of being able to take advantage of cloud architecture, cloud deployment capability, a multi-tenant ability, being able to segment out a test environment, a training environment, to be able to roll out and do essentially live prototyping, to automate the user acceptance testing process, to be able to, without affecting the rest of the organization, have the full-blown application running in that environment. That's something that we couldn't do with previous BPM. That's something that the platforms are offering today. So ultimately, the platform represents this fundamental shift towards being able to really get the optimal value from our current investments and from future investments, or limit the amount of infrastructure changes that we have to make. One of the things with BPM and the BPM platform is that we used to talk in terms of BPM trends and what's going on, the issues that affected BPM. Now we really understand that BPM is something that is affected by the rest of IT issues. So the three areas which are having the biggest impact today on the organization and on organizational and enterprise IT are this issue that we're talking about, the change in expectations around consumerization of IT, the impact of social networks and social computing capabilities, and both the impact from the standpoint of expectations as well as the opportunity that's presented by the cloud. So this is affecting how we look at all IT investments, including BPM. And from the standpoint of the BPM platform, we have the ability to make these things work together. The fact that now the way we interact with systems has changed considerably. With bring your own device and 24/7 connectivity, the separation of of work and life has blurred considerably. Our relationship with our customers, it's no longer a matter of just the transactions that we have in our system, but our customers are interacting with us, are understanding us, and in many cases communicating with us through a whole host of channels. And that relationship is the aggregate of all of those interactions. And as we move into this model where we're doing an increasing amount of work across social network channels, across our own devices, we need the work to follow the worker. It's a increasing but really exponentially moving amount of work is happening outside of the traditional enterprise applications and happening through these interaction channels and through user self-provisioned environments, whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook or Gmail. And we need the ability to not lock those down. That horse has left the barn, but we need to make that manageable. So what the platform provides, and this is something that, again, that we can do today, is the ability to take these interactions and move beyond the way that we understood BPM previously as basically a work list metaphor, where we would get to a certain task and launch a supporting business application, but move to a mesh or a composite application that brings tasks together in the context of these environments that we're working in. So this is one of the core values that represents this dividing line and really does present a picture of what's work going to be like in 2020. What are the steps that we can do today? What can we leverage today to get us to that point? It's moving towards what today we call a composite app. Increasingly, whether we call it the adaptive desktop or it's simply the way that we interact with things, it's having all of these internal and external channels, sources of information, things that are outside of our control, things that are under our control, bringing those together in an environment and leveraging from the platform the ability to compose the basis of the composite app, not define the core pieces. You know, as you look at this example here, you can see how that UI is going to change as I interact with that. The map's going to change. The visualization of the information that's presented to me is going to change. But what we can define in advance are the links, the rules for how these pieces come together. So it's not about trying to optimize the design of the UI so that UI pixel by pixel is set in stone and doesn't change. It's about being able to pull in the linkage of the various pieces, the supporting context, the supporting content that allows the work that we do to follow the worker. And this is one of these critical shifts that we're talking about. And this is something that not all, but the right business process platforms are enabling today. The ability for work to follow the worker. Now, if we think in terms of how work is done and the motivation behind work, our lives are inherently event-driven. And we talk about moving towards event-driven architecture, but the world is already event-driven. Something happens, and we have to respond to it. When that event occurs, there's context around it. Part of that context defines what we want the outcome to be. This is what we mean by outcome-oriented, goal-driven processes. We can't necessarily prescribe exactly the steps that we're going to take to get there, but we do know we've got basic rules and policies that we have to adhere to. We know that the state of that outcome is defined, and we know that in talking in IT terms, that there are a series of states that we're going to go to. So essentially, we're managing the state change based on rules, based on policies, based on the interaction. So I, as a knowledge worker, let's say I'm a claims adjuster, or I'm in a contact center, or I'm a criminal investigator. In each case, there's an event which is central to how I do my job. There's a whole set of policies around that, but ultimately what I'm doing is my own process of personal discovery, getting information, bringing that information in, moving as quickly as possible to the resolution of that event. But in doing so, I'm being guided by both rules as well as information. So rules are providing the guardrails. You know, it's not something that can be done completely ad hoc, where I can just make it up as I go. And then there's information. There's things that they're going to advise me as I go. It may be something, you know, fairly straightforward, that as I collect a piece of information, that kicks off a number of forms or documents that have to be filled out to complete that piece of information. Or it may be that I'm looking for something that's going to advise me on what I'm going to do next. It's this adaptable path that is pulling the information together, and the role of the platform is to provide that means to allow the work to follow the worker. And as I do this, as I respond to events, ideally I should get smarter and the system should get smarter. Every event has a life cycle, and every event has a half-life. Some research that a colleague of mine did, which is actually based on research that a colleague of his did, initially coming out of the space of analytics, looked at the value of responding to events and how there's a utility curve there that's shown by that red curve, in which clearly if you could respond instantaneously to an event, whatever the event, that's going to optimize the value. And with every event, that utility curve is slightly different. But in every case, over time, the value to your response declines initially fairly rapidly. And then after a while, it doesn't really matter. You think about it, any kind of customer service event, I call in, I go to the web, I do something to contact an organization to engage them in a customer service scenario. The faster they're able to solve my issue, the better. The greater the value is going to be for me. After a while, whether they get back to me in a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, pretty soon it really doesn't matter. The value has been lost. So there's a window there where the greater response, the better the value, the better of the realization of that value is to that organization. This came up recently in a conversation I was having with a bunch of Intel executives, and by Intel I don't mean the chip manufacturers, but I mean the three-letter agencies. We talked about their process, and initially, they were really looking at it as something that was, very unique, that there's no other business like them. But as we started to decompose it, we said, well, actually, your business just typifies the knowledge worker scenario, in that an event comes in, and they need to respond to that as quickly as possible, clearly. And you can imagine that, particularly as they're going through, they have to respond to every event before they figured out the validity or the severity of that event. So their utility curve is pretty steep. But it's not a matter of being able to simply automate that decision. It would be easy to say, okay, we're going to put in place an algorithm, and we're going to do a first pass, and we're going to eliminate 95% of your events, or we're going to put in a series of rules. In every case, they have to apply know-how to it. And ultimately, they need to be getting smarter. So for them, and this is what really stuck with me, they said their currency is not in response time. The currency by which they measure, and this is where they said that they were so unique, and as I thought about it, I said, that's not unique at all. It's measured in time to think. The ability to apply their know-how to those events. Ultimately, the business they're in is an information refinery that's about events and event-driven, and it's not unlike just about any other business today, whether it's financial services or anything for which there is the leverage of intellectual capital, intellectual property, which is just about every business today. And this is where we're getting into this notion of business event management, the ability to have in place that refinery. Process is a big part of this, but it's not ultimately about processing in the way that you can't define an end-to-end workflow that is scripted and entirely deterministic or predetermined. You can define aspects of this to gain efficiency, things that are repetitive and mundane, that to get that out of the way to provide more time to think. But that thinking time, that can't be automated. So we see now the role of the process platform, and this is, again, an area where this is, I'm convinced, exactly the type of infrastructure you're going to have in place in 2020. But it's also something that you can begin to use today. This is part of the leading edge business process platforms, the ability to have in place this business event management system. And if we look at the bottom, and we look at, from an enterprise standpoint, clearly for the Intel agencies, it's slightly different. But from an enterprise standpoint, this looks like what we have in place today. And essentially, our existing IT infrastructure is a giant event cloud. There's all kinds of events that are being kicked off some of which we're doing things about, some of which are coming out of transactional systems, some of which are coming out of either internal CRM or external CRM. Increasingly, CRM is going to be externally facing more so than internally facing as we get to the point where more and more of our interaction with our customers and prospects is through these external channels as opposed to our own predetermined channels. But in each case, we've got a bunch of events that are coming out. We need the ability to capture those events, provide some basic standardization on that, in some cases provide some transformation. But basically, we put in place an event pipe. The piece of software that exists in the platform or that exists in most organizations that most clearly resembles this event pipe today is in that enterprise service bus. But the issue is that we're moving away from that being a thing to that being a layer, that mediation that becomes a function of our infrastructure. It's no longer a single ESB. And we're starting to see that with a number of platforms out there. I will say that Cordis, in my opinion, is the furthest along in this area. But we're seeing that across all of the stack vendors, where through both acquisition and internal development, they're creating multiple gateways, enterprise service buses, local service buses, various means for mediation. In every case, there's a common set of standards. Around that, there's an emerging set of standards around that. One of the standards that is part of the organization that I'm involved with, called BPAF, is one of those. If you Google the term BPAF, you can find out more about that. But the idea is that we're being able to pull in events from a whole variety of sources and not completely standardize them, but put them into a framework in which they start to be manageable, and we can start to move them down this information refinery. So part of that is getting smart, is capturing patterns, is understanding that each event has its own separate and individual identity, but is also part of a pattern. And this is beyond the beers and diapers type of pattern analysis, if you remember from the 90s and the early discussions about business intelligence. This is really being able to correlate across multiple dimensions. This is why we call it complex event processing, that there's multiple pieces to this. But the best way for us to start to do that enrichment and refinement and to understand this is to do it in a social way. In other words, people are going to provide that refinement. So by putting in place and leveraging the process platform, the social interface to that, and the ability to move events through that, allowing individuals to do their own tagging and their own refinement or elaboration of those events, and to be able to follow the event through its life cycle, and then to put that into the knowledge base and understand not just the event in terms of what happened at the moment it occurred or the outcome, but to understand that pattern as it followed through its resolution. That's providing this ability to create the refinery and to become smarter as we manage these events. So ultimately, moving it in that direction, which requires the ability to define business rules, the ability to define processes, but also to manage them in an adaptable way. This is where the business process platform is providing this basis for business event management. So looking and closing on the issue of success factors, one of the issues that, and this basic notion which came to my attention probably 5 years ago with research that I was doing with BP Trends. I believe they're bptrends.org or .com. But if you're familiar with them, they're an organization that's focused on business process trends and issues, and we engaged in a study to see, why do BPM projects succeed? And why do they fail? And the fact is, whether it's Gartner or whether it's whatever source you want to cite, most organizations will admit that most BPM projects historically have failed. Now, in all honesty, most businesses have failed, most IT initiatives have failed. There are a host of reasons. But there did seem to be, for something that was so promising as BPM and business process transformation, there did seem to be an unusually high failure rate. And we hadn't seen much success or much research as to what were the patterns that were followed that led to failure, that led to success. So we did an initial study of about 100 organizations and found consistently that those that had in place a formalized center, whether it was called a center of excellence or whether it was called a program management office, that those organizations had a much higher correlation to success. And that was looking at about 100 organizations. So over the course of the last 2 years through BPM.com and culminating with research that we completed last year, we looked at 700 different BPM projects and looked at the degrees to which they succeeded or failed, and looked at it in terms of, was there virtually no success, was there a little bit of success, was there long-term and sustainable success. And then we looked at across a couple of different dimensions, but ultimately came up with categorizing into 3 groups. The structure of the teams that were in place, whether or not they had a formalized center of excellence, whether it was called that or not. And the name of it was unnecessary, and in some cases, calling something a center of excellence created more problems than it solved. But having that formalized commitment to having that center in place versus having an internal team that is dedicated and is defined, and that there's some structure around that team, versus having neither one of those in place, but simply having the expectation or the goal to create a center of excellence. And what we found was even more pronounced than that initial research. Overwhelmingly, those organizations that had long-term success, that really got into this direction that we talked about at the beginning of continuous transformation, overwhelmingly, the organizations within that group were those that had a formalized center of excellence or formalized program management team in place. Of all 700 organizations surveyed, 2/3 of them that had that in place saw great success, which means that more than 200% more, they were more than twice as likely than any other group to realize that success. On the flip side, a very small percentage of them did not see success. So one of the clear factors that we understood coming out of this is the benefit, ultimately the imperative, to have that commitment from the organization to put in place that team. Where it was simply a team, where they didn't have an actual business unit defined, they saw greater success, but not nearly to the extent that they saw by having that formally defined center of excellence. So in terms of the success factors, having that number 3, putting in place that center of excellence, and ultimately making that the center point for governance in the organization going forward, as well as in the research we saw that informed this, but going forward, we see that ultimately is the real leverage point is that governance in the organization is owned by that business process center of excellence. The other is, number two, being able to leverage the ability of having an information refinery by enabling social tagging of events. The best source for understanding the context and extracting that context and developing those patterns is how those events are understood and responded to internally. So this is really the leverage of social technology as it relates to process performance and process transformation. The other is having a single framework, and by 2020 we will not be talking, in fact we won't even talk in terms of unstructured versus structured. We may still be talking about adaptive and dynamic, but the delineation between structured and unstructured, what traditionally has been a wide gap, by 2020 that will be gone through both development and acquisitioning. We're already seeing that in M&A activity. That goes away. Well, we need to have a platform that supports both, and that's a critical success factor for today and for carrying this into 2020. Another critical issue is the notion of the ability to leverage standards. And I hear often that standards don't matter, that, that there's no value in standards. Well, it's true that there's not demand for standards, but there is demand for risk mitigation, for having some strategy for ensuring, or at least helping to ensure, forward compatibility of investments that are being made, for interoperability. So much effort is put into today the transformation, not just the transformation of data, and not the transformation in a good way of being able to put in place these changes, but simply transforming the assets that have already been captured and defined from the standpoint of requirements and the standpoint of models and from the things that ultimately are defining our systems. As we transform them, we lose context. We lose value. If instead we take an approach where we're putting in place the upfront investment in standardization and using standard industry standards such as BPMN, such as XPDL, such as XPath, such as other WSStar standards, to ensure that we don't have to go through those transformations, that we can have that interoperability, that is going to go a long way to delivering long-term value for our investments. And part of that, and another area that's generally lacks standardization, but going forward, the role of simulation and modeling is going to increase and ultimately play a critical role. There's the opportunity today, but it's really not taken advantage of by most organizations. So the ability to provide as a means for risk mitigation, for business optimization, for being able to explore new areas, bringing simulation to the platform level, not just the analyst workbench, but actually bringing it into the platform environment and working towards a benchmark and using that on a daily, continuous basis to assess performance, assess decisions, and provide a framework for optimizing business outcome. An area of standardization around that, the Workflow Management Coalition today is working on standards for ensuring interoperability for exchange of data in a simulation environment. But ultimately, there still has to be a organizational and architectural commitment to taking advantage of simulation at the platform level and really making it part of the reporting and optimization strategy. So that concludes the prepared part of the presentation. Now I believe Matt's going to join me and we're going to do some questions.
Thank you, Nathaniel. That was great. If there are any questions from anybody on the webinar, you can click the raise your hand button on the GoToMeeting console. Nathaniel, there were a couple of questions that came up while you were talking, if that's okay.
Certainly.
The first one was, do you see that those business events that you spoke about kind of being, the volume of those increasing because of this idea of big data and being able to analyze things? Do you see that will drive more business events that will then kind of trigger off the processes and things that you spoke about?
Yes, absolutely. And, just an example this weekend I thought of, you can't watch a baseball game anymore without realizing that you're looking at exabytes of event data now. All of the econometrics and the metrics that come out of basic activities, which before didn't have, the data was there were you to take the time to describe it, but we didn't have anything creating or throwing off that metadata or the event data. Now we're getting that event data from every possible source, and that's increasing geometrically. So absolutely, that's something that not only is it increasing, but the imperative to manage that is increasing at an even faster rate.
No, that's great. And I think the next question was slightly different and was more focused on, or the question was, do you think that the kind of the value of process improvement and that term BPM really is in the minds of the business people? Is it the people, do business people get that these kind of business process platforms help them do things? Do they know that they have a process problem? I guess is how I kind of took that question.
That's a good question, and I think I know exactly where they're coming from on that question. And I thought about that quite a bit over the years, as every annual survey of business leaders puts business process improvement as number one, number two, maybe worst case number three on their list of priorities. And the industry has said, see, that's why they want BPM. But you're right that and the asker of that question is right to imply or ask, and I would say, the answer is fundamentally yes. There is a gap between understanding the investment in BPM, the discipline of approaching BPM, making that commitment towards doing something differently as the means to realize that process improvement. I do think that the appetite for business process platforms, as this matures, as we see this ramp up, not necessarily over the 8 years between now and 2020, or not limited to that, but I would say fairly quickly, we're going to see a much greater uptake of that than we did in BPM. We're really moving into this late majority type of market, as opposed to the early adopters that really got how they could get a strategic leg up then with BPM investments. And we're willing to take that risk. I mean, BPM is something that, again, as I pointed out when we were talking about the statistics on this, was not universally successful. In fact, a slight majority of initiatives were unsuccessful. But as we move to this mode of continuous transformation, there has to be a platform that's able to support that. The need for that continuous transformation, that doesn't come from BPM. That's there, and that's going to be, and the pressure on that is going to increase considerably. But the
actually,
means
just had a good follow-on question from Philippe Guzman, and I hope you pronounced your name right, Philippe. And that was for enterprises with established business processes and tools to support those processes, what's the kind of compelling value case for BPM?
And I guess part of the question is which BPM. There are still organizations that have their processes defined and codified in environments that are going to see value from the first wave, the second wave, how we've been defining BPM for the last 5 to 10 years. But really, the compelling issue is moving into this direction of delivering new capabilities, the ability to take those applications, either wrapper or in some cases replicate those capabilities, to put them in a way that makes them more accessible, more manageable, more measurable, And longer term, the business process platform, whether that term sticks or not, whether we go with something else, long term, that is going to be the business operations platform. That is going to be what runs our organization. Now, not everything's going to be defined in BPMN. Not everything is going to look like BPM as we understand it today. But that is going to replace much of those existing applications, or, and as we know, legacy applications never die. But they will be relegated to be systems of record or reference systems that can be systematically retired as we put more and more capability into this manageable tier that sits on the business process platform.
That's great, and I think the questions are coming thick and fast, so I'll try and keep up. Where do you think that BPM Center of Excellence should reside? Is it with the kind of the program or project management office, or IT, or the business? And that was from Tony Puerto.
Sure, and that's something that both I have an evolving opinion of, but also we looked at very carefully in the research that I'd mentioned and follow-up research. The answer, of course, is it depends. Ultimately, the idea of governance and operations management as being this area where business and IT are blurred, and that's the interesting analog that's happening. Through the consumerization, the influence, the ability to control by IT and the influence by IT is in fact decreasing significantly. At the same time, the degree to which that business depends upon properly functioning IT is increasing at an equal or better rate. So that blurring between business and IT, that's happening already. For the last 10 years, we talked about business and IT alignment, and we talked about enterprise architecture being a function of that. But ultimately, when you looked at where those centers were, the origination was coming out of IT. And in the face of waning influence, you could see where they weren't aligning business. But as we get to the point where IT has greater control, or that's the wrong word, has a bigger stake in the delivery of business capability, their role in the business side is increasing. So that as we look at it in terms of today's fairly polar landscape between business and IT, ideally it should be in business because IT is losing that influence. But ultimately what we're seeing is that it's a new function that is coming where IT has a greater role in business, and business has a greater dependency on the capability and resources that are coming out of that organization.
So that seems to fit with what we've seen in Cordis as well, is that actually it is bridging both worlds as well. I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, but there's a couple more questions. The penultimate one is BPMS is somewhat novel, yet BPM seems to be fairly well established in large enterprises. What do you see as the burning reason or platform for getting businesses to adopt BPMS, above and beyond BPM, the discipline, I guess, and what is the value case for that?
Right. Well, again, it's in the delivery of capability, which is ultimately where value is coming from. The reason why we've had a gap between general understanding and recognition of BPM, which is now fairly mature. You go into most organizations and you're going to find generally there's an understanding of BPM. At least there's sort of an unquestioned understanding. They think they know what it is, whether they do or not. But there's not the same level of ready adoption, and you see that adoption is much more scattered. And that's because there is a discipline behind and that's necessary for adoption. It hasn't become institutionalized. It hasn't become that fundamental platform. But as we move to the point where the platform today we're calling the business process platform, whether that's called something else in the future, there is going to be a platform on which new capabilities are built and deployed, and this sort of app store type model is being followed, and the use of that and the impact of business events are being tracked and being pulled together and correlated in some centralized way. I see that being the business process platform that does that, and but that's going to be there no matter what. So today, the leverage point for doing that is this emerging generation of BPMS platforms that have made that leap into the business process platform. The value is being able to do that, being able to be responsive, to keep up with events, to meet your regulatory requirements, your SLA requirements. All of these things need to be done. The investments made in IT up to this point have not provided that leverage point to ensure that those things are being done. The most compelling opportunity for that today is the business process platform.
And the last question, but by no means the least, is I think it's kind of almost a terminology question, and what what these BPMS things mean. So if the question is, is workflow, or workflow is a term that's kind of used at the structured end of that process spectrum, and case management is kind of at the other end of that process spectrum. Is that kind of how you see the almost the history of these things, that the categorization of what workflow is and is very structured, and case management is inherently much less structured, and that spectrum of what a process or what a BPMS can do?
And I see that as being the division that's still relevant today, that by 2020 is gone to the point where we're not going to talk about it anymore. And there is going to be some necessary steps to get us to that point in which any discussion of that is completely obviated. Today, as a platform, you need to be able to do both successfully. I would say that imperative exists. That the delivery of that is not universal. So that is a means of differentiation among what would otherwise qualify as business process platforms, is their ability to manage processes as they're understood in the traditional workflow sense, and to manage them in the unstructured case management sense, where we're moving towards more of a business event response as opposed to a pre-structured process. But you can't have case management without structured workflow. And for any reasonable argument, you can't have structured process without being able to have that adaptive ability that defines case management. Up to this point, we call that exceptions. But you walk into any business and you talk about process and exceptions, almost every organization is going to say, yeah, but in our case, exceptions are the rule. So what do you do then? Are we simply operating outside of the lines when that happens? Well, if your infrastructure enforces that, pushes you out of the guardrails, and then it's not going to be successful. So you have to do both.
And one last one I promised that came in, it's just popped up. In those 700 projects that you surveyed and analyzed, did you kind of have a percentage of how many of them used BPM products from vendors, and how many used homegrown BPM software?
That's a good question, and the vast majority used some commercial version of BPMS, or when I say commercial, there's some open source, which I guess would be deemed non-commercial. But in other words, something other than homegrown. There were other qualifying criteria that would eliminate them. So while on one hand, it wasn't the goal to necessarily eliminate those that weren't using BPMS, and in fact, that initial study that I referenced, we didn't make that distinction, and better than half of the organizations were engaged in business process initiatives, not BPM deployment. But for the 700, and we spent a lot of time finding and capturing and interviewing those subjects. There were other factors that would otherwise disqualify them if they didn't have an actual BPMS system in place. So I would say probably 85–90% had actual BPMS.
Okay. Thank you very much on behalf of Cordis, Nathaniel. As everybody can kind of see on the screen, if there are any more questions, I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to cover them all, but just drop us a line at marketing@cordis.com, or I think everybody knows where to find Nathaniel on bpm.com, hopefully. But Nathaniel, thank you very much again, and thank you everybody for attending, and hopefully see you on the next one.
Yes, thank you, Matt, and thank you to everyone attending.